These shocking photographs show the skeletal state of British prisoners in Japan at the end of the Second World War. Hundreds of emaciated servicemen who had been starved and brutally beaten by their captors were found by Allied troops following the fall of Japan in 1945. Photographers were brought in to take pictures of the prisoners for use as evidence in any future war crimes trial. The images show gaunt and haggard men whose bodies were reduced to skin and bone, and some of their sadistic guards, including one known as the Black Prince and another dubbed the Mad Mongrel. They were both later hanged for their crimes. Other horrific pictures show men being tortured at the camps. Starving prisoners were pictured wearing false legs, having undergone amputations brought about either from being tortured or through contracting tropical diseases. There are images showing some of the most brutal Japanese guards, including the notorious camp commandant Lieutenant Yasuki, who was known as the Black Prince. He handed out beatings to men who worked on the death railway in Burma and beheaded one British POW in full view of his colleagues for trying to escape. Another depicted is Sergeant Seiichi Okada, who was dubbed Dr. Death. He carried out water torture on the detainees, which included pumping gallons of water into their mouths through a hose and then jumping on their swollen stomachs. The collection also shows a notorious Korean guard called the Mad Mongrel. They were all later convicted of war crimes and were hanged. Bizarrely, prints of the photographs could be purchased at the time by the POWs from the Far East section of the Returned British Prisoners of War Association. An album of almost 50 of the images has now been made available for sale at auction. Matthew Treadwind, of C. The museum closed a long time ago. Some of the images are quite horrific. You hear stories of the brutal treatment many POWs suffered at the hands of the Japanese, but it's not often you see the horrors. They do give you an idea of what these men went through. A lot of men suffered terrible ordeals and beatings which resulted in limbs being damaged and deformed. One of these pictures show a large group of them with artificial limbs. It is a very interesting and rare grouping. During the war, Japan captured nearly 140,000 Allied military personnel from Australia, Canada, Great Britain, India, Netherlands, New Zealand, and the United States. But it failed to follow the Geneva Convention rules of war governing prisoner treatment, which led to tens of thousands of Allied POWs enduring barbaric conditions in which they were starved, brutalized, and used as forced labor. Many were ordered to help construct railways, roads, and airfields, while others endured savage conditions in coal mines, shipyards, and factories. One of the most notorious examples was the construction of the Burma or Death Railway. Of the 60,000 Allied servicemen forced to work on the railroad, more than 12,000 died from maltreatment, sickness, and starvation. The images are being sold with a pre-sale estimate of £100 on September 18. The Pacific War in the Second World War was fought over a vast area encompassing the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia. It began in December 1941 when Japan invaded Thailand and attacked the British possessions of Singapore and Hong Kong as well as U.S. military bases at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and the Philippines. More than 50,000 British forces personnel surrendered to the Japanese between the fall of Hong Kong in December 1941 and March 1942, when the vast territories of the Dutch East Indies surrendered. A further 50,000 Allied troops were captured on 15 February 1942, when Singapore fell. These prisoners of war were used as slave labor by their captors over the next 3.5 years. Almost 1 in 3 died due to untreated disease, malnutrition, and brutality. Many civilians were also interned and forced into labor. While the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, now celebrated as V-Day, Japan's military leaders refused to accept surrender, despite the country's isolation and the fact that their countrymen and several thousand Allied POWs were starving to death. By the summer of 1945, a multinational Allied fleet had joined the vast U.S. Navy in the Pacific, ready to invade Japan. After final warnings of dire consequences, the United States unleashed an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6. Still, Japan refused to accept unconditional surrender. 3 days later, on August 9, the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. Only then did the Emperor intercede to bring the war in the Far East to an end on August 15, 1945, celebrated as VJ, Victory over Japan Day.